This is one of the best DACs I've ever had in my system, and I don't say that lightly. Its ability to retrieve information from recordings is extraordinary. I've played records I've known for years, sometimes for decades, and heard small details that I simply hadn't noticed before. But I think there's something missing. The WANDLA is a fully balanced DAC and preamplifier from Ferrum, a Polish audio company founded in 2020, with its roots in HEM, a company with a long history in the development and manufacturing of audio electronics. And despite its relatively compact size, the WANDLA is a remarkably sophisticated piece of equipment. Connectivity is comprehensive. On the digital side, we have USB, AES-EBU, coaxial and optical SPDIF, HDMI ARC, and I2². The I2² input is particularly interesting because its pin configuration can be adjusted in the WANDLA settings, allowing it to accommodate different I2² implementations, including the PS Audio standard. And you can see here the different configuration options available in the menu. The WANDLA also has an analog RCA input, which means that an analog source can be connected directly to it. On the output side, we have both balanced XLR and unbalanced RCA connections. And because the WANDLA incorporates both digital and analog volume control, it can also operate as a preamplifier, allowing it to be connected directly to a power amplifier. And there is, of course, a remote control included. It gives you direct access to the main functions of the WANDLA, including input selection, volume control, mute, and display control. And because the WANDLA can operate as a preamplifier, having proper remote control is more than just a convenience. When you're sitting in the listening position, being able to change the volume or switch inputs without getting up is exactly what you would expect from a component at this level. At the heart of the digital section is an ESS Sabre ES9038 Pro DAC, combined with Ferrum's proprietary SERCE processing platform. Ferrum uses a specially programmed ARM processor designed to keep the signal path as short as possible while handling much of the processing that would normally require additional chips. The WANDLA supports PCM up to 32-bit, 7068 kHz and DSD512, and also gives us a choice of digital filters, including proprietary filters developed for Ferrum by Signalist, the company behind HQ Player. There is also a proprietary 4-pin Ferrum power link connection for the optional Hypsus power supply. So as you can see, this is not exactly a minimalist DAC, and all of this comes at a price. The WANDLA GoldenSound Edition Gen 2 is priced at $32.95 in the US and $32.95 in Europe. That is certainly not inexpensive, but considering that the WANDLA is not only a DAC, but also a fully balanced preamplifier with analog and digital inputs, extensive DSP functionality, and a very flexible digital architecture, it is worth remembering that we're not talking about a DAC that simply converts digital audio to analog. There is considerably more going on here. And then there is the display. The WANDLA uses a color touchscreen, and I actually like the fact that the display automatically switches off after a period of inactivity. It also has an ambient light sensor, which allows it to adapt its brightness to the lighting conditions in the room, and that is particularly useful when you're listening in almost complete darkness. Because the last thing you want during a serious listening session is a DAC suddenly deciding to become a lighthouse. But I do think Ferrum could have made better use of it. There is simply too much information competing for attention at the same time. For example, the little graphics representing the connection type may look nice when you're sitting close to the unit, but from the listening position, it becomes almost impossible to read. The same applies to the input indication, which is pushed into the upper corner of the screen. Personally, I would have preferred a much simpler approach. Make the active input large, put it in the center of the display, and make it readable from the listening position. After all, if I'm sitting on the sofa, I shouldn't have to get up and walk across the room just to find out which input I'm listening to. But these are relatively minor criticisms, because the interesting part of the Wandla isn't what it looks like or even how impressive its specification sheet is. It's what happens when you actually start listening to it. And that's where things get interesting. I started my listening tests in the way I usually do. I replaced my benchmark DAC1 with the Wandla and changed nothing else in the system. No cables, no amplifier, no speakers, no other variable. I like to have a reference point, and when I'm evaluating a component, I prefer to change one thing at a time. There is a simple reason for that. To really understand a piece of equipment, you need time with it. And sometimes, even a month isn't enough. In fact, the Wandla spent almost 2 months connected to my system. And even after all that time, I still had the feeling that I was getting to know it. Because this is not a DAC that immediately tells you everything it has to offer. It's different. And my first impression was actually quite spectacular. The first time I played music through the Wandla, I honestly had to get up from my chair and check whether the subwoofer was switched off. The weight and impact of the low frequencies were extraordinary. This is easily one of the best low-end performances I've heard from a DAC in my system, and immediately remind me of the bass performance of a Marantz CD10 I owned some years ago. But the bass wasn't the only thing that caught my attention. The Wandla did something even more interesting. It started revealing information in recordings that I had listened to dozens of times before. And I don't mean that it simply sounded brighter or more analytical. In fact, quite the opposite. The Wandla doesn't have the most extended or spectacular treble I've heard from a DAC. And yet, somehow, information that had previously gone unnoticed suddenly became much more easier to follow. It was as if the Wandla wasn't adding detail. It was simply making more of the information already contained in the recording intelligible. And that distinction is important, because there is a downside to having a system that can reveal this much. A highly resolving system doesn't just reveal the good, it also reveals the bad. And in my experience, the Wandla made this more obvious than almost any other DAC I've had in my system. There's a track called Sanctuary by Welshly Arms that I've listened to many times and always enjoyed. But when I played it through the Wandla, I found myself almost avoiding it. Not because the Wandla was making the recording worse, quite the opposite. It was making it much harder to ignore what was already there. There is a considerable amount of saturation and distortion in the recording, particularly around the drum hits. Whether that distortion was intentional or simply part of the production, I don't know. But once I became aware of it, I couldn't unhear it. A truly revealing DAC doesn't make every recording sound better. Sometimes it makes you realize why a recording doesn't sound better. And that is something audiophiles don't always mention when talking about resolution. We tend to talk about detail as though more is automatically better. But more information also means more responsibility. If the recording is excellent, the Wandla can be astonishing. If the recording isn't, it isn't going to hide that from you. And that brings me to another interesting aspect of its sound. Compared with the ever-solo DAC Z10, which I also had in my system, the Wandla is considerably less exuberant. The Z10 has a more spectacular presentation, with very extended and highly detailed treble. The Wandla is more restrained, but despite that, I found myself discovering things in familiar recordings that I hadn't noticed before. And this is why I find the Wandla so difficult to describe simply as bright, warm, analytical, or smooth. Its tonal balance is remarkably even. There isn't an obvious emphasis towards the bass, mid-range, or treble. And yet the low end has an authority that is among the best I've heard, while the overall presentation remains controlled and extremely coherent. This DAC isn't necessarily trying to impress you. It is trying to show you what's actually on the recording. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. And sometimes you may wish it hadn't. One of the most unusual things about the Wandla GoldenSound edition is what Ferrum calls the GoldenSound processing. Using the processing power of its SERCE platform, Ferrum gives us a series of digital processing options that can deliberately alter the character of the sound. And one of the most interesting is the tube mode. Ferrum offers 5 different tube profiles: 300B, 2A3, KT88, EL34, and 7062. And I have to say, this is not one of those features that exists only so the manufacturer can put another tick in the specification sheet. You can actually hear the differences. The amount of the effect can be adjusted from 10% all the way up to 200%. And for my initial tests, I deliberately went straight to 200. I didn't actually listen to music at 200% when making my final judgment. The 200% setting was simply a way of identifying the different signatures. Once I knew what each profile was doing, I brought the level back down to 100% and performed my actual listening comparisons there. With some of the profiles, the amount of harmonic distortion becomes very obvious, particularly when the music becomes more complex. The 2A3 was a good example. At 200%, I could hear a very obvious increase in distortion, almost as if the tube were being pushed into saturation. For my taste, it was simply too much. The 300B was different. I perceived it as warmer and somewhat smoother, with less obvious distortion than the 2A3. The KT88 gave me a fuller presentation with sweeter sounding highs, and I didn't perceive the same obvious distortion that I heard with the 2A3 at the same setting. The EL34 moved in another direction. It sounded rounder and slightly more closed, with less apparent extension at the top end. And then there was the 7062. This was the one that caught my attention. The presentation seemed more open at the top, while the bass was slightly less full. And interestingly, it was the 7062 that I ultimately preferred in my system. It gave me some of the additional openness I felt my system was missing, without changing the overall character of the Wandla too dramatically. That was particularly useful with my Tynoid Dimension TD12, which have a very revealing presentation, but in my system tend towards a darker tonal balance. There is also a 6th option that I found particularly interesting: second only. As the name suggests, this mode focuses exclusively on second-order harmonic distortion. I liked it quite a lot, but ultimately I prefer the 7062 mainly because of that additional sense of openness in the upper frequencies. And this is where the GoldenSound processing becomes much more interesting than simply having 5 buttons labeled after famous tubes. It gives you the ability to tune the character of the DAC to your system and, more importantly, to your own taste. The Impact Plus processing gives you another tool for tuning the low end, and I found it particularly useful when working with a subwoofer. The final GoldenSound feature I want to talk about is Spatial Enhancement. The effect is designed to alter the spatial presentation of the music, and in my system it produced a noticeable wider soundstage. The difference isn't subtle. The soundstage expands laterally, giving the impression that the loudspeakers have moved further apart and that the music occupies a larger area between them. But I eventually decided to leave it, switch it off. Not because I think the effect is bad, quite the opposite, it works. I simply have a personal preference for hearing the spatial information as it was encoded in the original recording, rather than having the DAC manipulate the perceived dimensions of the soundstage. Perhaps I'm being overly conservative here, or perhaps I'm just a little too attached to the idea of leaving the recording alone. Either way, that's my preference. And I think this is an important distinction with features like spatial enhancement. There is a difference between something sounding more impressive and something sounding more faithful to the original recording. For someone who enjoys a wider, more expansive presentation, this feature may be exactly what they're looking for. The WANDLA also allows the spatial enhancement processing to be configured for either speaker or headphone use, so there is some flexibility depending on how the DAC is being used. After trying all these different ways of shaping its sound, what does it actually sound like when you simply let it play music? Compared with some of the other DACs I've had in my system, the WANDLA doesn't have what I would describe as the most extended or spectacular treble, and initially this bothered me. My Tannoy Dimension TD12 are extremely revealing speakers, but they also have a tonal balance that in my system tends towards the darker side. And with the WANDLA in the system, I sometimes felt that the combination was simply a little too restrained at the top. I tried to compensate for this by changing the interconnect from my straight-wire Rhapsody to a Kimber Hero. That brought a little more brightness and openness to the system, and the balance improved, but it didn't completely change my impression. At that point, I could have simply concluded that the WANDLA was a slightly dark-sounding DAC, but I wasn't convinced. And then I changed the loudspeakers. I connected the Monitor Audiophile 308G, which were here, and still are, for another review. And something interesting happened. That sense of missing treble extension became much less obvious. The WANDLA suddenly sounded considerably better matched to the system. The overall balance was more open, and I no longer had the same feeling that something was missing at the top end. The WANDLA can reveal an extraordinary amount of information without necessarily presenting that information with an exaggerated amount of treble energy. Those are not the same thing. I think this is probably one of the most important things to understand about its sound. It can be extremely revealing while maintaining a remarkably coherent tonal balance. And then there is the bass. The weight, control, and impact of the low frequencies are among the best I've experienced from a digital source. But the WANDLA isn't perfect, and this brings me back to the beginning of the review. I said that I thought something was missing. It isn't really a lack of treble. It's the absence of that slightly spectacular, hyper-detailed top end that some other DACs use to create an immediate impression of openness and detail. And depending on your system, that can either be a strength or a weakness. But if your system is naturally open and extended, the WANDLA's restraint can actually be a very good thing, because it gives you information without forcing it into your face. And then there is the golden sound processing. This is where the WANDLA becomes unusual flexible. The tube mode isn't just a gimmick. It can genuinely change the character of the presentation. What I like about all of these options is that Ferrum doesn't force you into one particular sound. You can leave everything off and listen to the WANDLA in its most straightforward form. Or you can deliberately shape its presentation to suit your system and your preferences. It isn't a component that gives you everything in the first 10 minutes. It rewards experimentation. It rewards familiarity with your system. And above all, It rewards listening. I think it's for someone who already has a serious system and wants a digital source that is exceptionally resolving without becoming artificially spectacular. And it's also for someone who is prepared to spend time with it. There's one thing I can say with certainty. I don't think this DAC changed the way I listen to music because it made everything sound better. It changed it because it made me listen more carefully. It made me discover things in recordings I thought I already knew. Sometimes those discoveries were beautiful. Sometimes they weren't. But they were there. And once you've heard that, it's very difficult to go back. If you enjoyed this review, subscribe to HiFi Room, and I'll see you in the next one.